Well, good morning. It's good to see all of you out. We'll be continuing our studies this morning. Been great stories of the Bible or from the Bible. I've labeled mine great events from the Bible. And just as a point of reference, and I sometimes say stories myself, but a long time ago, someone made the observation that when you say things in the Bible or a story, particularly when you're talking to children, they may equate it to like a fairy tale or something along that line. And so I've tried to get in the habit of calling things an account or saying that they are events so that it gives a stronger sense that it's grounded in time and history. Anyway, that's not a horse I ride. So I'm not offended by using that because, again, I use the term sometimes as well. But when I can, I try to think in terms of events and accounts just to be consistent. I think it's helpful for me to keep those things in that vein. So we're going to be dealing with the 10 plagues of Egypt, and this will be coming from Exodus chapters 6 through 15, which is a pretty lengthy section, and so we'll be only able to hit some highlights of that, but I had sent out yesterday some questions to consider as maybe we're reading through that material. We're definitely not going to read through the whole material. We're going to refer to things, and I'll put up some references as we go through. So anyway, that'll be our plan for today, is to cover the 10 plagues of Egypt. Before we begin, let's go to God in a word of prayer. Dear God, our Father in heaven, we come to you this morning grateful for another day. We're grateful for the beauty of sunrises and sunsets and of your creation all about us that show your handiwork and your power, your engineering abilities, your artistry, all the things that you have also instilled in us, qualities that you've instilled in us as your offspring and your creation. And we love to see those qualities in your handiwork. We're thankful, Father, especially for the handiwork of the history that you have recorded for us, the history that you have directed, that has brought Jesus to us so that we can know who he is, know who you are, and we can be benefited by the grace that you have brought to us that is so necessary because of our weaknesses, our shortcomings, the sins that we commit against you. We pray, Father, that you will help our hearts, that we will not be willful, that we will be penitent when we do those things that are wrong, that we will seek relationship with you and strive to get better and do better than what we have in the past. We're thankful, Father, for the accounts that you have given us of your working with mankind throughout history. They give us hope, they give us faith, they give us patience as we work toward that end when we will be with you in heaven one day, which is our great hope. Please grant us wisdom and understanding as we discuss your word. And pray, Father, that we'll be closer to you for these efforts. These things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. I'd like to briefly thank everyone for the interest, the prayers that have been shown toward us related to my mom's accident last Sunday where she fell, broke a hip. Got to have a total hip replacement for that, and she was in hospital most of the week, and she's now back at Creasy Springs in the section where she was, the memory care section. Physically, she's making reasonable progress for her age and all that's gone on. She doesn't understand at times what's going on, and trying to recuperate with painful things that are necessary for recuperation when you're not sure why it's happening or why these people are hurting me. That can be challenging to work through, but making progress, and we're thankful to God for that. So anyway, just like to give that brief update and expression of appreciation for the concerns that have been expressed towards us. This shows the Exodus from Egypt. We're not going to spend much time in here, but we'll note that, and I don't have a mouse and have a pointer that only shows in one place. The Israelites are at this point prisoners, slaves in Egypt, and they actually inhabit primarily the area of Goshen. And of course, the nation of Egypt is much larger than that, and is there any benefit for them being in Goshen? Why did they get stuck in Goshen?
Well watered. They had flocks and herds, and they needed that good pasture land.
Okay, so that was the prime land for raising livestock, and yeah, so that was one of the things. So they had a benefit because they had an insider that was able to Joseph, that was able to garner the kind of the best lands for them. And there's maybe some other things, Mark.
I'm not sure if you consider this a benefit or not, but as I recall, they also, their profession was offensive to the Egyptians at large.
Yes.
So they had been given that land that they were kind of section themselves
Oh,
away from.
very good. And those are the two things that I had in mind, with this is that their use of livestock was different. The Egyptians considered a lot of livestock like deity. And so the uses and keeping of the livestock that Israel did was offensive to them. And actually that comes up in the account related to the 10 plagues, in that they are saying we need to go somewhere else to be able to sacrifice to God. We can't do it here or we'll be executed, here. Jonathan?
Historically, so extra-biblical sources, that would be the reign of Hyksos, which were foreign kings, so they weren't Egyptian rulers, and they were actually reigning in that area as well.
Okay.
The Pharaoh of Joseph would most likely been Hyksos, and then the Pharaoh of the Exodus would most likely been non-Hyksos.
Okay. And so the land then, say that again about the part of the land?
Joseph ruled from that area as
Oh,
well. So
oh.
Joseph being right-hand to Pharaoh, been with Pharaoh.
Okay.
His family would have been here.
Okay. So as a stranger in the area, they would have been put in a different location than the rest of them. Very good. Okay, so anyway, that has a little bit of history that relates to some of the things that are mentioned related to the plagues. What I'd like to do, one of the things I ask you to do is to put this event in the context of Bible history. Why are the 10 plagues important? And the 10 plagues are the occasion for the Israelites leaving Egypt for the Exodus. So why is this important in history? And what I'd like to do, I'm going to go through this and give maybe a little bit more detailed but a structured background as to what gets us here. If you have something to add at the end, feel free to do that. But anyway, I kind of wanted to bring this out to hopefully make a flow, and so I don't want to necessarily spend the whole class on this part, and we'll get to some other things as well. But if we go back to the book of Genesis, God makes a creation. The creation is good. It's what God wanted it to be. Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden, and they are, God is walking with them. They're walking with God. They have a relationship with God. And then sin enters through the serpent beguiling Eve and then Adam. And so then there's a separation, and things are not the way that God had intended them to be. And God makes a promise in Genesis 3:15, which may seem a little bit veiled if you're first reading it, but it makes sense as you get more familiar with the Bible accounts. But in Genesis 3:15, God said, I will put enmity between you, the snake, or the serpent, Satan, and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring, he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So God is promising a remedy, and that the seed of woman is going to bruise the head of the serpent, which, if you want to kill a serpent, that's what you do, is you aim for the head. And so that's a promise that ends up providing a theme for the rest of the Bible throughout centuries and centuries of time. And so to know that this promise is going to be fulfilled, that there's a seed and offspring of the woman that's going to fulfill this promise of bruising the head of the serpent, you kind of got to keep up with the lineage from that woman. If God's going to be shown to have kept his promise, if God's going to be proven to be faithful in his promises, you got to kind of keep up with the lineages to know that this has happened. And so what we see is that early in the book of Genesis, there are a lot of genealogies given. And later in the Old Testament, sometimes there are chapters and chapters of genealogies, and people read those and wonder, why would anybody put all this stuff in the Bible? But there's a purpose to it. And And so in Genesis 4 and verse 25, it says that Adam and Eve have Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel, and then they start some genealogies in Genesis 4:25. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. So Seth is now going to be the child of promise. And we infer that Adam and Eve had other children because there are women to marry the sons that they have, like Cain. But Abel was supposed to be the child of promise. Cain killed him, and so Seth is now the child of promise. And so it goes directly from chapter 4 and verse 25 into chapter 5, where it starts giving genealogies. And so it goes from Adam to Seth, not Cain, not others, but Seth. And the genealogies are given all the way down to Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That stops the genealogies, and there's a little more history that goes on, the flood, things like that. And then in chapter 10, we pick up with the genealogies, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. Their genealogies are given, but they're given in different order. Shem is last, and that segues into the chapters which have been added at a later time. But the descendants of Shem are continued, not Ham and Japheth, but just Shem, are continued. And in chapter 11, we have genealogies from Shem down to Abram, who is later known as Abraham. So we have this handpicking of people that are part of the lineage through which the seed that will bruise the head of the serpent is going to come. In chapter 12, we have a number of promises, but 3 especially important promises that are given to Abram. And that is that God is going to give his descendants a land, that his descendants are going to become a great nation, and that through his seed, there's going to be a seed, all nations of the earth would be blessed. And we understand that now to be referring to Christ, Jesus, who would bless all nations by bringing the forgiveness of sins that have been brought into the world. So we have those promises given to Abram, later Abraham, in Genesis 12, a land, a nation, and a promise. And then the rest of Genesis gives us background information on these 3 great men, Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, and then some of Jacob's sons as well, Joseph in particular. So Genesis 12 through 23 gives us a lot of information about Abram's life. 24 through 27 tells us about Isaac's life. 28 through 36 gives us the account of Jacob's life. And then in 37 through 50, we get the account of the son of Jacob, Joseph, and him being sold as a slave into Egypt. And so that gets the family of Abram down into Egypt, and he goes from being a slave to second in command of all of Egypt. And that is the occasion of the Israelites going, and all 70 to 80 of them, going down to Egypt, and they start living in Egypt. They're in a protected environment because they are a favored group of people because of the relationship of Joseph to the leaders in the nation there. And so they are in a protected environment where they can go from 70 to 80 people to when they leave in the Exodus, there are 600,000 men, not counting women and children. So if there were one man and one woman and one child per man, we'd be close to 2 million people, and it probably was more than that per man. So God promised that he would become a great nation. Well, them being in Egypt has got them on their way. They've gone from 70 to 80 people up to probably over 2 million people that are going to be leaving Egypt. And God has promised them a land, the land of Canaan, and now they're going to be heading back to the land of Canaan. And, my thoughts, so what? Why is this important? Why is it important that the nation of Israel form and that they get back to the land of Canaan? Well, the way that I picture this is that God is providing a lineage through which he is going to fulfill his promise that he made to Eve. And we know that he's keeping his promises by being able to follow that lineage all the way from Eve down So we're going to find out is Mary and Joseph the parents of Jesus in the New Testament. What's interesting about the nation of Israel is that it's made up of, it grows from 12 sons of Jacob. Each one of those is a tribe, and these tribes are fastidious in keeping up with their genealogies. It was really important to them to know which family they came from. That family heritage was just almost everything to them. And so that's why we have lineages throughout the Bible, but the lineage to Christ is only going to come through one. But we have this nation that protects this genealogy and the tribe that is going to bring forth the Jesus, the seed that's going to bless all nations. And we need this nation. A nation has to have a land. So we have the land, the nation, and now we have the material setup to which, when it's God chosen time, that the Messiah can come, the seed promise that will bless all nations. But things go south in Egypt. Rulers arise that don't know Joseph and his family, and they just see the large numbers of people that are accruing among these Israelites, and they decide they need to put them in servitude so that they can't rise up and overthrow them. And so they put them in servitude, and they treat them very harshly. The servitude is grievous, is the way that it's often described in the way that they are being treated. And a thought question is one of them that I put in the questions to give some thought to. Why? I mean, these are supposed to be God's special chosen people. Why would he allow them to get into this state of affairs where they're being persecuted and treated terribly before he decides to rescue them? Anybody have a thought about that? Jonathan?
In most of Exodus and other parts of the Torah, it's all about keeping them pure from outside influences. And one way to do that is to ostracize them from the outside influences. That could be one of the reasons why, one of the main reasons, but one of them.
Yeah. And I think that's a part of this whole picture is that we have a protected, initially they were protected by the graces of the government because the government saw them as favorable, but then they're ostracized and considered prisoners, but that still keeps them protected and isolated as a pure population of people. Anything else? Mark? Mark and then Scott.
Another element of the Old Testament is showing us God's character and his ability to keep his promises regardless of the outside circumstances. And it's really hard to deny an element of you coming from the lowest of the low in one of the nations that was at its peak at that point in time, to the point where they're not only sending you out, but sending you out with a number of their own treasures and everything else, to send you out of the land and go from the lowest of the low slave to suddenly being conquerors of another space. And that's only going to happen by the grace of a very, very powerful entity.
Okay. So their delivery from that bondage and the wealth that they take with them as they leave shows the grace of God and his care to take them from one really low state to a much more favored state through his care. Scott?
I think he wanted them to develop a desperate need to get away from slavery.
Okay. Yeah, if, toward the end of this reading, I believe it was in chapter 15, when Pharaoh has already, his troops have been drowned in the Red Sea, and they get 3 days away from Egypt, and then they find they don't have any water, and they immediately start complaining and, turning against Moses. And then we see in the book of Numbers, as they go into the wilderness wanderings and so forth, they keep looking back to Egypt as though it was a really great place to live. Wow, we had such good food back there. We had plenty of food. What are we doing out here in the wilderness? If they had had a really good life in Egypt, would they ever have left? I mean, what would be the inducement for them to leave? Because even after they left under what many of us would, just run to get away from, they kept looking back as though, well, that was a really good place. So I think that, part of it is that they needed some hardship to get them to want to leave at all. So anyway, those are speculative, but I think that may be a part of that. There's, I think, some truth to all of those. So anyway, we have them down in Egypt now, and we have a nation that is going to be getting some laws to guide them soon, but we have a population that warrants them being considered a nation. They have a tribal system that keeps up with genealogies so that we can trace God's promises from Eve all the way down to the New Testament at the time of Christ. And we need to get them out of Egypt. So, do you know the 10 plagues? I never memorized them, I don't think, until we learned this song. So they call it a children's song, but I find all the children's songs are actually help me learn things. So we're going to sing this, okay? If you can see it, I'll lead us through it. The water turned to blood, frogs, lice, flies, and the murrain of the cattle, boils and hail, locusts, thick darkness, death of the firstborn. One more time. The water turned to blood, frogs, lice, flies, and the murrain of the cattle, boils and hail, locusts, thick darkness, death of the firstborn. Okay, thank you. And we may try that one more time before we get done. And actually, there's a chart here of Old Testament, particularly Old Testament chronology, and I meant to be showing this while I was talking so you could follow some things through, but I forgot to get that far. So the next thing I'd like to do is to go through the plagues. And in going through the plagues, I'd also like to answer one of the questions that I put as kind of a subplot. And one of the questions I put in is that the record suggests that God manipulated Pharaoh. He said, I will harden, or I have hardened Pharaoh's heart in multiple locations of the text. And the question is, did God take away Pharaoh's free will? Pharaoh's ability to choose when he hardened his heart? Is that something supernatural God did, or is this some other mechanism by which God hardened his heart? And I asked it mainly using this text, explain the concept of God hardening Pharaoh's heart, and do we know how he did that? And could that happen to me? Could God harden my heart? Yes, Jonathan?
I just want to mention something real quick. The
Sure.
two words there, when that's translated hardening, actually means to make heavy.
To make heavy.
Yeah, and based upon the understanding of the time, at least of the Egyptians, that meant to be sinful. A heavy heart
Okay.
is sinful.
Okay.
Something that I've come across, and that's helped me understand.
Okay. So the Hebrew word that is translated harden carries with it the concept of heavy, and heavy is burdened and burdened with sin. Yeah, that's a nice connotation to it. Mark?
Another variation I've heard of that is that harden can also be translated strengthened, or given as more of kind of like given to courage,
Mm-hmm.
or to the element of what you're already set to do, that
Okay.
you're going to have the wherewithal to continue on down that path.
Okay.
So even building them on that element of the heavy or the sinful heart, if Pharaoh was already set on this,
Mm-hmm.
what God put in front of him would have been not been God saying, I'm taking away your free will, but the pathway that he was already following, he was more going to be reaffirming that pathway of,
Okay.
yes, I think this is what I have to do because I have to prove.
Okay. So we can have our heart strengthened. We can be encouraged or given courage to do what's in our heart, whether that's good or evil. We can still be encouraged to take that pathway. And I think those are good thoughts, and I think that they are right on line with what we draw from the text. Let's go through these, and this will remind us of the plagues, and also be keeping those thoughts in mind as we consider, how does God affect our hearts. And part of the reason I'm doing this, and we're not going to get into it obviously in this class period, is that there is a doctrine that's often summarized as Calvinism. And it teaches that God is sovereign, and he's sovereign to the point where man does not have free will. And I personally believe that that's a false doctrine. But the case of Pharaoh is sometimes used to support that. Well, God hardened his heart. God caused him to be the way he is. And I don't think that necessarily fits in well with the context that in this passage. So we're just going to deal with the context here. I think the definitions and insights that have already been shared fit in well with what I believe the scenario involves. But let's make a run through this. In chapter 7 and verse 3, this is before the plagues even started. God said, the Lord said, I will harden his heart. And it's stating a fact is the way that I would interpret that. He's stating the fact, I will harden his heart. It doesn't necessarily specify how he would do that, but it does say that the Lord is going to harden his heart. In chapter 7 and verse 13, we have the event related to the rod being turned into serpents. And it says that his heart was hardened in that situation, but it doesn't state who hardened it. So that's left open in the immediate context. But we may note that he hardened his heart when he observed that the magicians were able to mimic the sign that Moses and Aaron had given. And when he saw that they could mimic that, then it says his heart was hardened. So there were circumstances surrounding this that would imply that the events had an impact on his heart, maybe strengthening his heart in the direction he wanted to go, or it being heavy towards doing what he wanted to do to begin with. In chapter 7, verse 22, when the water was turned to blood, again, his heart was hardened, but it's not stated who hardened his heart in that specific context. But again, the magicians had mimicked the sign that Moses and Aaron had given, and when he saw them mimic it, then it says his heart was hardened, without specifying the agency of that. In chapter 8 and verse 15, when we have the frogs that take over the land, there it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. So even though God says, I'm going to harden his heart, there are going to be several places where it actually says that Pharaoh hardened his heart or strengthened his heart. He is pointed in the direction that he was already going to go. Even though it doesn't say, it says Pharaoh hardened his heart, but it also notes that the magicians had copied and were able to mimic the signs that Moses and Aaron were able to do. And also, he had requested that the frogs be removed, and it was after the frogs were removed. So the frogs would be an impetus for Pharaoh to let God's people go, what God had told him he had to do. But once the frogs were gone, he changed his mind and did not let the people go. And it's at that point that he says his heart was hardened. So that's the context of that hardening. In chapter 8 and verse 19, we have the lice, or some would say that or gnats might be a term that's used. It does specify here that Pharaoh hardened his heart. In context, it says that. In the immediate context, it doesn't state who hardened his heart, but at the next sign, it says that he hardened his heart again, or hardened his heart also, referring to the time before. So when we get to the next sign, we're going to see that his hardening is attributed to himself, and it says that he did it also, implying that this influx of the lice was a time where he hardened his own heart as well. And of interest, this is the first time the magicians state that we can't do this, we can't repeat this, and their acknowledgement is that we've used some kind of trickery or sorcery to do what we did, but now we can't even do this. And their conclusion was, this is the finger of God. But then Pharaoh hardened his heart anyway, even when the people that would be in the know of his court said, this is the finger of God, he would not relent. The next sign in 832 is that of flies. And again, it says here that Pharaoh hardened his heart. It's interesting at this point that it says that Goshen, the area where Israel lived, was now spared. So they didn't experience the influx of flies that the Egyptians suffered from, which suggests that they had been going through the same plagues up to this point in time. Any thoughts on why God would put his own people through those plagues up to this point in time? And this is, I think, somewhat speculation, but it fits some patterns that we see. Andy?
Well, they could have been told about what's going on.
Okay.
To see it, and then to experience it, and then to hear about further, but they could be separate. It's just, there's a whole experiential learning that's taking place, I think.
Yeah.
Which is to, one, help them understand who God is, two, to help them understand who they are compared to the Egyptians, and there's a separation.
Mm-hmm.
And to see the bigger picture.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. If suddenly this building was filled with flies so that we could hardly even see each other, we would have much more appreciation for what happened in Egypt, right? And that appreciation for what happened in Egypt, if we were told on Wednesday night that when you come back Sunday, halfway through the Bible class, the building's going to be filled with flies spontaneously, that would be impressive. We could come in and the building's already full of flies, and we say, well, who let these in, But, and this is the thing about all these plagues, is that Moses, well, with the frogs, he asked, you tell me when you want them to come. And Pharaoh was something enough to say, well, tomorrow. Or when you want me to take them away, is what he said. When do you want me to take the frogs away? And Pharaoh said, we can handle them till tomorrow. You can do it tomorrow. And I remember Ken Seals did a series of lessons here a number of years ago entitled One More Froggy Night, which was dealing with this event. But anyway, to be able to predict when it's going to occur, we would have much greater appreciation for God if we were to experience those things. Now, he's given us the records. We can believe that they're true. But as Andy mentioned, experiencing them is even more impressive. Jonathan?
It also kind of ramps it up in Pharaoh's mindset, because first, his priests can repeat it, and then now with the gnats or the frogs, not only can he cause it, but he can take it away when he wants to. And then with lice, he can cause it, take it away, but now the priest can't do it. And now not only can he cause it, take it away, the priest can't do it, but now he can say, okay, you guys over here will be okay, you guys here not so much.
Yeah.
So it's increasing his control, and it's kind of piling more on the Pharaoh.
It is. Each step is more impressive in terms of God's control of the situation. Yeah, that's great. Eric?
And we also need to keep in mind that God did respect the Pharaoh as the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh did not go over and conquer these people. These people, through their ancestor Jacob, came and surrendered or submitted themselves to the Pharaoh because of circumstances of the famine in the land. So these people belong to Pharaoh, and God will not take them until the Pharaoh himself consented to let them go. So God, I'm not saying God had the power to just, okay, I'm taking my people. He could have done that, but he respected the law of the land, or the order. And but meanwhile, he controlled nature and the frogs, and that's his control.
Yeah.
It's not Pharaoh's control. God's under no obligation, because throughout Scripture, many places, even with Israel themselves, we find that God hardens hearts, he blinds them so they can't see. As you've said, a lot of it has to do with the predisposition, but he can do that. He's under no obligation to open your eyes and to soften your heart, if you will. Now, the Pharaoh saw the same miracles that the children of Israel saw. His heart went one way, others went the other. And it's the same when Jesus came. They all saw the miracles. Some came running, others went running. So,
Yeah.
it has to do with as you mentioned before, the predisposition.
Yeah. And so, I mean, Pharaoh could make, we talk about raising our children, teaching them to make good choices, make wise choices. Yeah, he could make wiser choices at any point in time. if he wanted to, but he refused that option unless he was under dire pressure, and then he relented only for a short period of time. Okay, so, you know, and in this point between the flies and the cattle, they're talking about, you know, we need to leave, and you know, Pharaoh says, well, just go a short distance. Don't go a long ways away, because he didn't want to lose them. And this is where they say, well, we've got to go far enough away to where we won't be massacred for sacrificing the animals that, you know, the people of Egypt consider holy. And then the next plague is a disease that wipes out the cattle. So, you know, they could have gone and sacrificed as demanded by God if he had let them, but Pharaoh would not respect that, and so the cattle were affected by the disease process, in King James called the murrain of the cattle. But again, his heart is hardened in this situation. It's not stated who hardened it in this particular event. Next, they have in 9:12 boils that affected everyone, and it states that the Lord hardened his heart in the incident of the boils. In 9:34-35, they have the hail that, you know, and I don't think that hail is a common occurrence in the area of Egypt from a geographic and climatic standpoint, but this was considered hail unlike any that had been seen, and it basically destroyed the vegetation, and anyone that was out in it, animals that were out in it, would have been killed by it. And when Pharaoh experiences this, he acknowledges, I have sinned. But as soon as the hail stopped, then he turned and would not let the people go. So under the pressure of the hail, he acknowledged his wrong activity, but as soon as he got relief, he turned back to his original heart. In 10:1 and then verse 20, have the locusts, and the locusts come and wipe out everything that the hail did not wipe out. And again, it says the Lord hardened his heart. Pharaoh says, I have sinned, but when the locusts are removed, then he returns to his original position and will not let the people go. So only under dire pressure will he acknowledge that he is in the wrong. As soon as the pressure is gone, he returns to his original position. 10:28, the darkness comes. It says that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart related to that. And this is the time where Pharaoh, once the darkness is removed, Pharaoh tells Moses, do not return, do not come back to me. And Moses says, well, okay, I won't. I'll never see you again. And that leads to the final plague, 11:10, the firstborn die. The Lord is said to have hardened Pharaoh's heart with that plague. And then Pharaoh actually commands the people to leave. And God had said at the very beginning of this section that Pharaoh would drive them out. And so God put the pressure on Pharaoh to the point to where he commands the people to leave in 12 and verse 31. But interestingly, in 14 verses 3-5, he later regrets having sent the children of Israel away or letting them leave. And he asked the question, why have we done this? Like, you know, we were fools to let them go. And in that context, it says, you know, Egypt is destroyed. You know, the land was completely destroyed. And he's asking, well, why would we let them go? We're just destroyed is all. You know, it's kind of like a Monty Python, and it has a leg amputated, and it says, it's merely a flesh wound. Anyway, I digress. Okay. So, hardening of hearts. In Exodus chapter 9, verses 16 and 17, it says, but for this purpose I have raised you up. God talking about Pharaoh. For this purpose I have raised you up to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. You are still exalting yourself against my people and will not let them go. So God says that he raised up Pharaoh so that God would have the opportunity to show his power throughout all the earth. So these plagues are meant to highlight God's power to anyone that hears about these or finds out about these. but I raised you up. God could have raised up apparently anyone to have been Pharaoh at this point in time. Why was this Pharaoh the Pharaoh of the Exodus? I think is an interesting question to consider. And just for the sake of time, I would suggest that, that it was because of his heart. We've talked about he had a heart that he strengthened, that he hardened, he strengthened toward arrogance and unwillingness to listen to reason, or the pressures that God had put on them. God could raise up anyone, but he raised up the the Pharaoh that would suit his purposes in ruling among the nations. And so I think he picked this Pharaoh because this is what I get reminded of when I read about this Pharaoh. He's a stubborn donkey, and he's unwilling to yield to whatever pressure comes on. And this reminds us of another passage that's not talking about the Exodus specifically, but in the book of Daniel, it's talking about Nebuchadnezzar and some things that he's about to go through. And it says, the sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision is by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will and sets over it the lowliest of men. To me, one of the great lessons as I, over the years, have studied the Old Testament in greater and greater detail is that God rules among the nations. That's a theme that you cannot miss or ignore if you study the Old Testament sequentially. God rules in the kingdoms of men, and that's part of the identity of God that we need to recognize and appreciate and submit to. Matt?
We touched earlier on Calvinism,
Mm-hmm.
and the main passage I usually hear Pharaoh Calvinism brought up in is Romans 9.
Uh-huh.
And obviously we're not going to get into all of Romans 9, but this is exactly what Romans 9 addresses.
Mhm.
I chose Israel. I chose this particular people for my name's sake, to show my power to the nations. He does that throughout the millennia, and he began as they formed into a nation, doing it and overcoming Pharaoh, just like we've been talking about today.
Yeah, very good. And there are a number of passages that could support these thoughts, but maybe that segues into a separate study sometime. Yes.
This passage ties, I think, earlier into your question about why the Israelites had to go through that suffering. Sometimes I think we get stuck thinking that our story is just about our story, and not actually we are in God's story, and God's story covers thousands and thousands of years of world history. And everything in the Old Testament is a story, it's a prequel to the story of salvation. So for the Israelites, they were a story for generations later to hear about God's deliverance and the same way He delivered us from sin.
Yeah.
Which encourages me if I'm going through something hard. I don't know what this story's going to look like 500 years from now. I just know God's writing it and it's going to be okay.
Very good. And we're getting very close to the end of time. And this is one of the things I'd hope that we would wrap up with is, what does this mean to me? And God has a plan. And it involves a lot of things that we don't understand, but the purpose of his plan is that he will be glorified. And sometimes it may mean that I need to suffer in order that he may be glorified. And am I like Pharaoh, a stubborn donkey that is unyielding to God's influence? Or can I go through good times and then go through bad times? And it doesn't matter what times I'm going through, I see them all as God's times in a way that I can honor God and bring glory to his name even when I'm going through difficult things. And I think that's one of the lessons that come to us out of the 10 plagues. I saw someone else that would look like they wanted to say something. Andy, were you going about to say something? Okay. Kevin?
I think it's also neat, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of passages throughout the Old Testament that point to this event.
Yeah.
God brought them out of the land of Egypt and saved them with an outstretched arm for his name's sake, not because of their goodness or anything. But this is what all the Jews would look back to. God saved us. And it's just like we were just saying, Christ saved us. And it's what we look back to as Christians, the cross. That is the event that sets us apart. This is their event.
Christ is our exodus, yeah, from the sin and slavery that we suffer from. It's great thoughts. The impact, one of the things I ask you to think about is the impact that this would have and on whom. And of note, and that's the first bell, I think, right? That's the second one? I turned my hearing aids off, I guess. That's, is that these plagues actually appear to be directed at what the Egyptians would have considered their gods. Okay, so they were pantheistic. They believed that there was a God for everything. And I know you can't see all this, but for each of the plagues, there's one or more Egyptian gods that would have ruled over that area, and God showed his supremacy over each one by the plagues that he chose. So, that's a very interesting thing. Repeat the song, which we won't do. And just outside of the reading in Exodus 18, verse 11, who is this impacting? This is Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. He says, "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, for in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them." So Jethro recognized that God's plagues showed his supremacy over all the gods that the Egyptians had been worshiping. And that's a message that goes even 40 years later into the land of Canaan. When they're going in to conquer the land of Canaan, the people there are still remembering the plagues where God showed his superiority over the idols of men. So thank you so much for your attention and your participation.